That is the number Mira wrote at the top of a fresh page the morning after the wall came down. She underlined it once. Then she looked at it for a long time without writing anything else. 27 days before the next full moon rose over Ashenford. 27 days to find something in 400 years of natural philosophy, herbalism, church records, and her grandfather's marginalia that no one had ever found before, because if anyone had found it, the word would exist. There would be a name for what kale was. There would be a treatment. There would be a record. There was nothing. She had already checked. 27 days was not enough time. She knew that. She started anyway, because not starting was the only thing that was definitely not enough time. Ask yourself this. If you had 27 days to save someone, not from something ordinary, not from illness or injury or debt, but from a force as old as the moon itself, as indifferent as tide and season, as certain as the calendar on the wall. What would you spend those days doing? And more importantly, what would you be willing to become in the doing of it? Mira was about to find out the answer to both questions. So was Cale. So, in his own way, was Aldrich. And somewhere in the dark of the Greywood, Sir Devon Hark, further gone with every passing night, the man inside the monster losing ground one moonrise at a time, was about to do something that changed every single calculation anyone in Ashenford had made. Episode 2, The Iron Moon. Stay close. The sun came up on a village that had not slept. Not all of it. There were children who had been held so tightly by their parents in the dark hours that they had eventually gone under from sheer exhaustion, small bodies surrendering to sleep while the adults above them stayed rigid and awake. But the adults of Ashenford had spent the night doing what frontier people do when something has broken through their walls. They repaired the walls, and they talked, and they waited for morning to tell them whether the thing in the dark had been real. Morning came. The gap in the north wall was real. The splintered timber was real. The churned mud of the square, the fallen torches, the specific wrongness of the silence from the Greywood, all of it was real. Morning had not made any of it less real. In some ways it had made it more so, because daylight means you can see exactly what was done and measure its size. Bors the blacksmith was at the wall before the sun had fully cleared the tree-line. He was not a man who needed to be told what to do in a crisis. He looked at the gap, calculated the timber required, calculated the labor required, and went to find both. By mid-morning there were 6 men working with him. By afternoon the gap was closed. The new timber was pale and obvious against the old dark wood, a wound with a fresh bandage over it, the repair visible from anywhere in the square. Osric watched them work from his study window. He had been awake since before the wall came down. He would remain awake for another full day before his body finally overruled his mind and forced him to sit in his chair and close his eyes for 3 hours. He would not call it sleep. Sleep required surrender. What Osric did was something more like a negotiated pause. His youngest son had brought him food twice. Both times he had eaten it without tasting it, looking at the journal open on his desk. His grandfather's handwriting. The word wolfkind underlined 3 times in the margin, the ink pressed so hard into the parchment that you could feel the grooves from the other side. His grandfather had been a frightened man when he wrote that entry. Osric had only ever known him as composed, certain, unshakable, the kind of man who made you feel safer by being in the room. Reading the journal was like finding out that the mountain had been afraid of the storm too. It did not make the mountain less solid. It made it more honest. The honest truth, as his grandfather had understood it 60 years ago and as Osric now understood it, was this: the wolf kind were real, they had always been real, and the recorded attempts to destroy one had uniformly failed. The recorded attempts to contain one had sometimes partially succeeded. And there was one entry, 3 lines, the handwriting different, faster, written in a different season judging by the ink, that mentioned something else. Something that had not been tried. Something that his grandfather had written down not as a solution but as a question, the kind of question a man writes when he does not have the courage to pursue the answer himself and hope someone who comes after him will. Osric read those 3 lines several times. Then he went to find Mira. Mira had not left her desk. This was not a figure of speech. Between the night of the wall and the moment Osric knocked on her door, she had moved from the desk to the cellar steps twice, once to bring kale water, once to check the integrity of the new chains she had Bourse make in the days before the moon peaked, and had otherwise remained in her chair with her books arranged around her in the specific ordered chaos that meant she knew exactly where everything was and no one else could find anything. Her notebooks. She had 3, of different ages, the oldest with a cracked spine that she had repaired twice with fish glue, were open to different pages simultaneously. This was how Mira worked. She did not read one book at a time. She read 3 or 4 in parallel, looking for the places where they disagreed, because disagreement was where the interesting information lived. Consensus was what everyone already knew. The spaces between the consensus were where something new might be hiding. She had found several things. None of them were solutions. Most of them were confirmations of what she had already suspected, which was useful in the way that being told you are definitely lost is useful. It stops you wasting time hoping you are not. The church records were useless in the way that church records were often useless about anything that complicated their cosmology. They acknowledged the existence of the wolf kind. There were too many consistent accounts across too many centuries and too many regions to do otherwise. But their response was theological rather than practical. The wolf kind were fallen. The wolf kind were cursed by God. The appropriate response to a wolf kind was to pray, to flee, or to put it down with silver-worked iron if you had the means and the courage. The philosophical texts were better but still not good. There was a Moorish physician whose work had been translated into poor Latin sometime in the previous century who had studied the condition with the rigor Mira recognized as genuine. He had documented 7 cases. 5 had ended in death, the wolf kind, not the physician. 1 had ended ambiguously. 1 had simply stopped, mid-record, the account trailing off in a way that meant either the physician had died, had fled, or had found something so significant that he had stopped documenting it in the book he had kept before. Mira had read that trailing account 4 times. She could not determine which of the 3 possibilities it was. She needed the rest of the book. The rest of the book did not appear to exist in any collection she could reach from Ashenford. She wrote the physician's name in the margin of her notebook and underlined it. Not twice. Once. She was saving the second underline for something she was more certain of. The herbalism texts were interesting in a way she had not anticipated. There were 3 plants referenced across 4 different sources in relation to the management of the wolf kind condition. Not a cure, never a cure, but the word management appeared twice in different hands across different centuries, which meant the idea had survived long enough to be written down more than once, which meant someone somewhere had observed something that looked like it might work. The plants themselves were not unusual. 2 of them grew within a day's ride of Ashenford. The 3rd was more problematic. It grew at altitude, in specific limestone soil conditions, in a part of the country that was currently under the control of men who would need a reason to let a healer from a frontier village pass through their territory. She added this to her list of problems. The list was getting long. She did not mind. A long list of known problems was better than a short list that was hiding things. She was on this train of thought. Plants, altitude, limestone, permissions, the problem of being a woman traveling alone to places that required permissions, when Osric knocked. She opened the door. He was standing in the morning light with his grandfather's journal under his arm and an expression she recognized from the one time she had seen him make a truly difficult decision in public, the year the river had flooded and 3 families had needed to be relocated and 2 of them had not wanted to go. The expression of a man who has already decided something and is coming to tell you about it, not to ask. He came inside. She put the kettle on. He placed the journal on her desk, open to the 3 lines she had not read yet. She read them. She sat down. Then she read them again. What Osric's grandfather had written, in that faster hand in that different season, was this. He had written that in his research he had found one account, a single account, unverified, from a man whose name he gave but whose credentials he questioned, of a wolf kind who had not progressed. Who had been bitten and cursed and had carried the curse for 11 years without losing himself to it. Without the change becoming total. Without the man disappearing into the creature. He had written that this man had done 3 things consistently that no other documented case had done. He had never missed a moon. Meaning, he had always been chained when the full moon rose. Not sometimes. Not most times. Every time, without exception, for 11 years. The grandfather had underlined this. He had kept a record of himself. A journal written in the days between moons, a deliberate accounting of his own mind and memory and the specific texture of who he was. Not what he had done, but who he was, what he valued, what he remembered, what made him laugh, what made him grieve. As if he believed that identity was a muscle that required daily exercise to remain strong. As if he believed that the curse worked on the man who did not know himself as much as on the man who could not be contained. And third, he had not been alone. He had had one person who knew the truth. Who treated him as a man and not a condition. Who held the record of him on the nights when he could not hold it himself. Osric's grandfather had written these 3 things and then written, in the margin, in an even smaller hand, barely legible, "This is not a cure. But it may be a life." Mira read this 3 times. She thought about Cale in the cellar. She thought about the broken chains and the gold eyes fading back to dark and the expression the narrator had said had no name. She thought about Devon in the Greywood, further gone, every night, because there had been no one to chain him when the moon rose, no one to hold the record of him, no one who knew he was still there. She thought about what the difference was between those 2 men, and she thought she now understood it more precisely than she had before. One of them had been alone with the curse for 6 weeks. The other had been alone with it for 11 years and survived with his mind intact. The difference was not in the curse. The curse was the same. The difference was in everything else. She picked up her quill. She wrote 3 headings in her notebook. Under each one she wrote what they knew, what they did not know, and what they needed to find out. Then she drew a line across the page and wrote a 4th heading that she had not planned to write but that appeared under her quill before she decided on it. The 4th heading was, Devon. Under it she wrote one word. Possible. Ashenford was not a large village. It had the specific geography of all small communities. Information moved faster than people, and silence moved even faster than information, because silence had a shape and a weight that people noticed before they noticed anything else. By the 3rd day after the full moon, the silence around Myra's cottage had a very specific shape. No one had been told anything officially. Osric had not called a meeting. Mira had not spoken to her neighbors. Aldrich, who was possibly the most important witness to what had happened in the square, had said almost nothing to almost anyone, partly because he was still working out what to say, and partly because no one had asked him directly, and he had not yet developed the habit of offering information that no one had asked for. But Ashenford had eyes. It always had. The blacksmith had made chains, heavy chains, iron chains, the kind that were not for animals. The young guard from the north gate had been seen going in and out of the healer's cottage at unusual hours. The healer herself had not been seen outside in 3 days. Lord Osric had visited the healer's cottage twice. The light in the cottage window had been burning every night until well past midnight. None of this was conclusive. All of it, taken together, had a shape that the village could feel even if it could not name it. The name came from an unexpected direction, as names usually do. A woman named Hilda, the wife of a farmer whose pasture had been destroyed, who had therefore a more direct and personal relationship with the events of the full moon than most of the village, had been watching the cottage. She was not a malicious woman. She was a frightened woman, which is a different thing, though the practical difference can be small. She had watched the gate guard come and go. She had watched the Lord come and go. She had watched the light burn through the night. She had drawn her own conclusions. Her conclusions were not entirely wrong. They were not entirely right either. But they were the first conclusions to be spoken aloud in company, and in a small village, the first conclusion spoken aloud has a way of becoming the foundation on which all subsequent conclusions are built, whether or not it deserves to be the foundation. What Hilda said, to 3 women at the well on the 4th morning, was this. There was a man in the healer's cottage who was not what he appeared to be, and the healer was hiding him, and Lord Osric knew, and the wall had not come down by accident. Most of this was true. The part about the wall was not. The wall had come down because Devon Hark had been inside the curse for 6 weeks with no restraint and no recognition, and the wall had simply been in his way. But the part about that being an accident was a complicated question. The moon had not been an accident. The curse had not been an accident. Whether those things counted as the wall coming down by accident was a philosophical question that Ashenford was not in the mood to engage with philosophically. By noon the shape of the silence had changed. It was sharper now. It had an edge. Osric felt it from his window. He had been feeling the temperature of Ashenford for 60 years. He knew what this particular temperature meant. It meant he had less time than he had thought before the village stopped being frightened in the way that made people quiet, and started being frightened in the way that made them loud. He went to find his eldest son, who was the most sensible person in the village after Mira and possibly before himself. He had a task for him. The task involved riding fast. On the 5th morning after the full moon, Cale came up from the cellar. This was not a dramatic event. Mira had decided that keeping him underground for 27 days was not practical, was not necessary given the moon's current phase, and was likely to do more harm than good, not to the village, but to Cale, and a Cale who was deteriorating in isolation was a less useful variable than a Cale who was functional and present and could be observed. She had read enough of the Moorish physician's notes to believe that isolation, in cases like this, was not neutral. It had an effect. It was not a good one. She told him to come up. She told him the rules. He did not argue with any of them. He took the cellar room at the back of the cottage. He kept to the cottage and the small yard behind it. When Mira needed him to demonstrate something, the rate of healing, the response to certain compounds she was testing, the state of his eyes in different light conditions, he cooperated with the focused patience of a man who understood that he was also a subject of research and had decided that this was acceptable. He kept out of sight of the road. He did not speak to anyone but Mira, Osric, and Aldrich. Aldrich. This had been Myra's idea. Though she had framed it as Osric's when she suggested it to both of them, because she understood something about men that occasionally served her well. Sometimes they accept the same thing more easily when it appears to come from a different direction. What she had understood was this: Aldrich had done something in the square that night that he did not yet have a framework for. He had stood his ground not because he was trained to stand his ground and not because he was unafraid, but because something in him had decided that the ground needed to be stood on and that he was the person standing on it. That kind of decision, made once in a crisis, does not automatically become available again. It needs to be understood before it can be made deliberately rather than instinctively. Cale, who had spent 15 years in the Third Order learning how to make that kind of decision deliberately, had something to teach. They began in the yard behind the cottage on the 6th morning. Not with weapons, Cale had assessed Aldrich's existing competence with a spear on the first day and decided that technique was not the primary issue. The primary issue was something that had no good name in the vocabulary Aldrich had grown up with. The Third Order called it the governed self. The idea that a person had 2 versions of their response to danger, the instinctive response that happened before thought, and the chosen response that happened after it, and that training was the practice of making the chosen response faster, until it arrived before the instinctive one, or at least alongside it. They talked more than they moved. Cale asked questions. Aldrich answered them, sometimes accurately and sometimes inaccurately, and Cale did not always correct the inaccuracies immediately. He waited to see if Aldrich would arrive at the correction himself, and he was right about when he would and wrong about when he would, approximately equally often, which told him something useful about how Aldrich thought. On the 8th day Aldrich asked Cale a question that surprised them both. He asked what it felt like when the change started. Not to be intrusive, he said this first, in the careful way of someone who has rehearsed the sentence before saying it, but because he thought that understanding what Cale was managing might help him understand what Cale was trying to teach him. The idea that fear was a thing you managed rather than a thing that managed you. Cale was quiet for long enough that Aldrich started to apologize. Then Cale answered. Not briefly. He described it as pressure from the inside. Not pain, not exactly pain. Something more like the feeling of a room that is too full of people, where the air itself has weight, except the room is you and the people are something that does not have a name yet because the language was made by people who had never been in that room. He described the way it started slowly, in the hours before the moon peaked, a restlessness that felt like anxiety but had a different texture, sharper at the edges, less dispersed. He described the chains as something he was grateful for, not because they stopped him but because they gave him something to push against, and pushing against something was the difference between a fight and a flood. Aldrich listened to all of this. When Cale finished, Aldrich said, "That sounds like what it felt like in the square, before I decided not to run." There was a pause. Then Cale said, "Yes. I imagine it does." After that, the sessions in the yard were different. They were still instruction. But they were also something else, a word that neither of them used because it was not the kind of word either of them had much experience applying to themselves. The word was companionship. On the 10th day, Osric called a meeting. He did not announce it in advance. He told his eldest son to tell 7 specific people to come to the hall at midday, and those 7 people to tell no one else. 6 of them arrived. The 7th sent a message saying he had another engagement, which was not true. Ashenford did not have the kind of social calendar that produced genuine competing engagements at midday on a Wednesday, but which Osric understood as its own kind of message. He noted the absence and moved on. He told them what he knew. Not everything, not the 3 lines from his grandfather's journal, not the specifics of what Mira was attempting, but the essential shape of it. There was a man in the healer's cottage who carried a condition that was dangerous on the nights of the full moon and manageable on every other night. The man had come to Ashenford not to threaten it but because he was dying and there was a light in a window. He was cooperating with every measure being taken to contain the risk. The healer believed there was reason to continue. Osric believed the healer. He told them about Sir Devon Hark. Not his name, not yet. But the shape of his situation. That the creature in the Greywood had once been a man. That the same curse that Cale had was in Devon, further advanced, without the management that had kept Cale functional. That what was happening to Devon was the answer to the question of what happened when this was left untreated, alone, unwitnessed. He told them this not to create sympathy, though he understood sympathy might be a useful byproduct. But because he believed that a village making a decision needed to understand what they were deciding against as much as what they were deciding for. 2 of the 6 agreed immediately. 1 asked questions for 20 minutes and then agreed. 1 said she needed to think about it and left, which Osric had expected and was not concerned about. She always needed to think, and her thinking was usually good, and she usually arrived at a reasonable place. 1 said nothing for a long time and then said that he trusted Osric's judgment and would abide by whatever was decided, which was both generous and a refusal to commit, and Osric filed it under the category of support that would hold unless things got difficult. The 6th man, a farmer named Garrett, whose land was in the eastern fields adjacent to where Pip's flock had been destroyed, said no. He said it clearly. He said it without anger, which was worse than if he had said it with anger, because anger passes. Clarity has a longer half-life. He said that he understood what Osric was telling him. He said that he believed Osric was acting in good faith. He said that he had also looked at the gap in the north wall and had also seen the mud in the eastern field and had also been lying awake at night listening to his children sleep, and that his answer was no. The man in the cottage was not safe. The Greywood was not safe. The argument that this could be managed was the argument that people made before things went wrong, and things had already gone wrong once, and his answer was no. He left. Osric watched him go. He did not try to stop him. He had known when he invited Garrett that this was the probable outcome. He had invited him anyway, because a decision that excluded the people most likely to disagree with it was not a decision, it was a plan, and plans made without accounting for opposition were plans with a fundamental structural weakness. He called the remaining 5 together. He told them what he needed from each of them specifically. He told them how long they had. He told them that if Garrett talked, and Garrett would talk, because a man who says no that clearly says it to more than one room, they needed to have already done enough that the no became harder to act on. 27 days. 17 of them left. The village of Ashenford had just split in 2. Quietly, without shouting, without torches. In the way that small places always split. One person at a time, one conversation at a time, over weeks rather than hours. Until one morning you look up and the line is visible and you cannot remember exactly when it appeared. Mira, who was not at the meeting because Osric had not invited her, he had made this choice deliberately, and she had understood it and agreed with it, was at her desk when he came to tell her what had happened. She listened. She asked one question. He answered it. Then she went back to her books. 17 days. In the Greywood, time moved differently. This was not mystical. It was the experience of a man who had almost no external markers by which to measure it. No window. No market bell. No meals at regular hours. No faces that changed in the way that human faces change, tired at night, rested in the morning, shifted by weather and conversation and the ordinary accumulation of days. There was only the forest, and the light that filtered through it, and the dark that replaced the light, and the moon. Devon was aware of the days in the way of an animal. Not counted, but felt, as a rhythm in the body, a pressure and release. He was aware, in the way that the thing he was increasingly becoming was aware of all things, of the moon's position in its cycle at all times without needing to look at the sky. It was not knowledge. It was sensation. The pull and slackening of a tide that had nothing to do with water. The man inside, and there was still a man inside, though his territory had grown smaller and his hold on it more effortful, recognized this awareness as wrong. Not wrong in the sense of morally wrong. Wrong in the sense of not having been there before. In the sense of being something added rather than something he had always possessed. He had a name. He held to it. Sir Devon Hark. He said it sometimes in the dark, because saying it required the machinery of language, and the machinery of language required the machinery of thought, and thought was what the man inside was made of. It was the last and most essential material of himself, and keeping it in use was the only form of exercise available to him. He remembered Cale. He did not know if Cale was alive. He had not known for 6 weeks. He held to the not knowing because the alternative, deciding that Cale was dead, closing that account, letting the question resolve into certainty, felt like a door closing, and he had enough closed doors inside him already. Every full moon another one. Every morning after, less room. He had stopped going close to the village after the night of the wall. Not from fear. From something more complicated. He had been close enough to Ashenford that night to smell the torches and hear the horses and feel the specific electric quality of human fear at scale, a whole village afraid at once, the collective weight of it. He had been close enough to know that there was a man on the wall with a lantern who had not run. He did not know the man's name. He knew the lantern, the stillness, the specific quality of chosen courage rather than frozen fear. And he had felt, through whatever remained of the man inside, something he had not felt in 6 weeks. He had felt recognized. Not by the lantern holder did not know him. By the quality of the moment itself. A person who could choose to stand when everything said run was a person operating by the same set of values he had operated by, before. The third-order values. Hold the line. Not because the line can necessarily be held, but because the line needs to be held, and you are the person standing on it. He had turned away from the wall. He had gone back into the Greywood. He had done this deliberately, with the specific effort of a man choosing a direction rather than being driven by one. It had cost him something. He did not have an accurate accounting of what. He knew this. He was further gone than he had been the morning after the last full moon. He knew it the way you know a wound is worse before you look at it, by the quality of the pain, by the things that are harder today that were possible yesterday. What was harder today was the name. Sir Devon Hark. He could still say it. But there was a delay now between the intention and the sound that had not been there before. Not a long delay. A fraction of a second. A fraction that had been smaller last week. He noted this with the same flat precision that he had once used to assess the state of a bridge or the integrity of a fortification. He noted it and filed it in the part of his mind that was still doing that kind of noting, and he thought, 27 days until the next moon. And, I have 17 of them left, if my count is right. And, I need to decide what to do with them. He had not yet decided. But the fact that he was deciding rather than simply existing was itself a data point. It was a man's fact. It was his. He held on to it. On the 14th day Mira ran out of books. Not out of books entirely. Her shelves were still full. But she ran out of books that could tell her something new about what she was trying to do. She had extracted everything available to her in Ashenford on the subject of the wolf kind and on the related subjects of transformation, of identity under physiological extremity, of botanical compounds that affected states of altered cognition, of historical cases of men who had lived with conditions that should by all accounts have destroyed them and had not. She had 3 notebooks full. She had a list of conclusions. She had a list of questions that remained unanswered. The list of unanswered questions was longer than the list of conclusions. She had reached the edge of what she knew, which she had expected, and the edge of what she could find out from where she was, which she had also expected, and the beginning of the territory where she was going to have to do something more difficult than reading. She was going to have to try something. The 3 plants from the herbalism texts. 2 of them she had. The third, the altitude plant, the limestone soil plant, the plant that grew in territory that required permissions she did not have, she had sent a message about, through Osric's eldest son, who was currently writing fast and carrying several letters that Mira and Osric had written together, to people they were not certain would respond and who might respond in ways they could not predict. In the meantime, she had the 2 plants she could reach. She had been thinking carefully for several days about what to do with them. The Moorish physician had not specified preparations. He had only noted the plants by name and noted that they had been used in management and had not specified whether he had observed this himself or been told it. The distinction mattered. Observed and told were different kinds of evidence. She prepared the first compound on the 14th evening. She tested it on herself first, not out of recklessness but out of method. She knew her own baseline. She knew what any reaction she had would tell her about the compound's behavior in a body that was not under the specific pressure of the wolf-kind condition. This information was useful even if the reaction in her was different from the reaction in Kale. A compound that produced no reaction at all in her was less interesting than a compound that produced something, even if what it produced in her was different from what it would produce in him. She sat at her desk for 3 hours after taking it. She noted everything. The notes were precise and clinical and slightly eccentric in places, because the compound did produce something, a mild sensation of warmth in the sternum, a quality of attention that was slightly heightened, a very faint peripheral awareness of the room that she would not normally describe as awareness, exactly, but which she did not have a better word for. She wrote all of this down. She thought about what this meant for Cale. She thought about what managed meant, and whether that was enough, and whether enough was something she was willing to accept or something she was trying to surpass. She thought about the third plant and whether the message had arrived and whether the answer would come in time and whether time was the actual constraint or whether the constraint was something else, something she had not yet identified because she had not yet run into it. She thought about Devon Hark, alone in the Greywood. About the word possible she had written in her notebook. About whether that was optimism or evidence. She decided it was evidence with insufficient supporting data. She would find more supporting data. This was not a decision she made with conviction, exactly. It was a decision she made because the alternative was not deciding, and not deciding was a decision too, and she had looked at what that decision produced and found it unacceptable. She went to bed for the first time in 4 days. She set her own internal clock for 6 hours and woke approximately on time. She felt marginally better. She went back to work. 13 days. On the 15th day, Garrett spoke to 10 people. Osric had expected this. He had expected it to take longer, which was the only thing that surprised him. Garrett was usually a patient man. Something had accelerated his timeline, and Osric spent part of the 15th morning trying to determine what. The what, he discovered by mid-afternoon, was Hilda. Not Hilda herself. Hilda had retreated into a watchful silence after her conversation at the well, partly because she had been spoken to privately by Osric's youngest son and partly because she was a woman of more nuance than her initial conversation had suggested, and nuance requires quiet to operate. But what Hilda had started, the shape in the air, the temperature of the silence, had reached Garrett before Osric's meeting, and Garrett's no had been formed in that context rather than in the context of the full information Osric had provided. This meant Garrett's no was a different shape than it appeared. It was not a no to what Osric had told him. It was a no to what he had already decided before Osric told him anything, and what Osric told him had not been sufficient to change a decision that had been made before the meeting began. Osric filed this under, "My mistake. I should have spoken to him sooner." He went to find Garrett. The conversation that followed was long and took place in the eastern field, where the new flock, Garrett had helped pay for it, which was the kind of man he was, the kind who put money behind his anger rather than just his anger, was grazing on the autumn grass with the specific contentment of animals who do not know what had happened to their predecessors. Osric and Garrett walked along the field's edge. Osric listened more than he spoke. He had learned decades ago that a man who says no can sometimes be reached by being listened to, and sometimes cannot be reached at all, and the only way to know which kind of no you are dealing with is to listen long enough to find out. Garrett's no, it turned out, was the first kind. Not entirely. He was not going to become a supporter. He was not going to change his position. But underneath the no was something Osric had not fully accounted for. Not fear, or not only fear. Something more personal. Garrett had a brother who had died badly, years ago, on the northern frontier. Not from a wolf kind. From an unchecked thing, a thing that could have been managed and was not, because the people who knew about it had decided that containing the information was worth more than containing the risk, and they had been wrong. And Garrett had been the one who found out too late and had spent several years after that being angry about it and was still, if Osric was reading him correctly, still angry about it, had never fully stopped. What Garrett needed was not to be convinced that the risk was manageable. What Garrett needed was to be convinced that the information would not be contained. That if something went wrong, he would know. That he would not be the person who found out too late again. Osric made him a promise. It was a significant promise. It cost something to make. He made it anyway, because a promise that costs something is the only kind that means anything, and Garrett was the kind of man who knew the difference. Garrett did not become a supporter. But he stopped actively working against them. In a village splitting quietly in two, this was not nothing. On the 19th day, Devon made his decision. He had been working toward it since the night of the wall, in the way that a person works toward a decision when most of the working is happening in territory they cannot fully observe. The man inside thinking in the gaps between the times when the man inside was not in full possession of himself. It was not a reliable process. But it was the only process available. What he decided was this: he was going to go toward the village rather than away from it. Not into the village. He was not gone enough to have lost the understanding of what that would mean, of the scale of the harm he could do. But he had been living in the Greywood for weeks with the specific poverty of an existence that had no fixed reference points, no walls, no name spoken aloud, no evidence that the world he had inhabited before still existed and still had a place in it that was his. He had been existing in the absence of all the things that the Moorish physician's notes, had he known them, would have identified as essential to maintaining the self under this specific kind of pressure. He could not have all of those things. He understood this. But he could have one of them. He could have evidence that the village was still there. That the wall had been repaired. That there were lights in the windows and smoke from the chimneys and the ordinary commerce of human life continuing on the other side of the palisade. He could be in the presence of the world without being a danger to it. He had controlled himself enough on the night of the wall to leave when the moon was covered. He could control himself at a distance, in the daylight hours, in the non-moon phase of the cycle when the pressure inside him was at its lowest ebb. He could not know if this would help. He had no evidence that proximity to human life and human pattern had any effect on the rate of his losing himself. The hypothesis was untested. But the Moorish physician's notes, which he did not have access to, but which he had arrived at independently through the specific expertise of being the subject of the experiment rather than its observer, suggested that isolation was not neutral. That the absence of a fixed point outside yourself contributed to the loss of the fixed point inside yourself. He moved to the edge of the Greywood. Not the wall side. The south side, where a rise in the land gave him a vantage point from which he could see the smoke of the village chimneys and the movement of people on the southern road without being visible himself. He watched for several hours. He said his name. He watched the smoke. He noted the quality of the light and the movement of clouds and the specific small details of ordinary life continuing, a cart on the road, a child being called in from a field, the sound of the bell that marked the midday hour in Ashenford. He felt, very faintly, the specific quality of being witnessed even at a distance by a world that was still doing what worlds do. He filed this under, data. Under, inconclusive but not nothing. He came back the next day. And the day after that. On the 22nd day, the response came. Osric's eldest son rode back into Ashenford in the late afternoon with his horse at a lather and a leather satchel across his back that he did not let go of until he had put it directly into Myra's hands. Inside the satchel were 3 things. The first was a letter from a woman named Sister Anselm, at a monastery 2 days' ride south, who identified herself as the keeper of the medical library there and who wrote with the precision and economy of someone who had spent decades ensuring that information survived the people who held it. She knew the Moorish physician. She had the rest of the book. The second thing was a packet of dried plant material, wrapped in wax cloth and sealed, with a note in Sister Anselm's hand indicating the preparation method. The third was an invitation. Mira read the letter 3 times. Then she sat very still for a moment in a way that Aldrich, who happened to be in the room, recognized as the specific stillness of someone who has just found something they were not sure they were going to find. Then she stood up and started organizing. She made a list of what she needed to take. She made a list of what needed to happen before she left. She made a list of what needed to happen while she was gone. She gave the third list to Cale, who read it without comment and then said, "I can do this." She gave the second list to Aldrich, who read it and asked 3 clarifying questions and then said, "I can do this." She gave the first list to herself and started packing. Osric, who had been watching all of this from the corner of the room where he had seated himself when his son arrived and where he had remained with the patience of a man who has learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is be a reliable presence and not obstruct the people who know what to do next, said nothing until Mira paused in her packing and looked at him. She said, "I'll be gone 3 days. Maybe 4. He said, "Go." She went. The 5 days before the moon that followed were the strangest 5 days Ashenford had lived through in recent memory, and recent memory in a frontier village is not short. Mira was gone. Cale was managing the tasks on the list she had left him with the methodical competence of a man who had spent 15 years executing plans under adverse conditions. Aldrich was managing his list with the focused determination of a man who was learning what he was capable of by the process of being required to do it. Osric was managing the village, the temperature of it, the split in it, the specific social geography of a community that was holding 2 incompatible positions simultaneously and had not yet been forced to choose between them. Garrett watched. He did not act. He had made a promise too, in the eastern field, not as explicit as Osric's but real enough. He was a man of his word. He watched, and he waited, and he kept his own counsel. In the Greywood, Devon watched the smoke. Mira came back on the 25th day. 4 days, as she had said. She came back with the rest of the Moorish physician's book, not the original, which the monastery kept, but a transcription in Sister Anselm's precise hand, made in the 3 days Mira had been there. She came back with a full preparation of the 3rd plant compound. She came back with 17 pages of her own notes made during conversations with Sister Anselm, who had turned out to be not only the keeper of the library but herself a practitioner of the medical arts of a quality and range that Mira had not encountered before in any person she had met, and whose conversation had been the most professionally stimulating experience of Mira's life to date. She also came back with a piece of information that Sister Anselm had offered at the end of their last conversation, almost as an afterthought, in the way that people who have spent a long time sitting with knowledge sometimes offer the most important piece of it at the end rather than the beginning. The man in the Moorish physician's 6th account, the case that had ended ambiguously, the case where the record trailed off. Sister Anselm knew who he was. She had found a reference in a different archive, years ago, that had identified him. And the reason the Moorish physician's account had trailed off was not that the physician had died or fled or found something so significant he had stopped documenting it. It was that the subject had recovered sufficiently to leave. To go somewhere. To have an afterwards. The Moorish physician had considered this so unexpected that he had not known how to document it. He had written the account up to the point of departure and then simply stopped, because what came after departure was not something he had a framework for, and he had been an honest enough scholar to refuse to invent one. Mira absorbed this. She thought about it for the 2-day ride home. She thought about what it meant for possible and whether possible had just become probable, and whether probable was enough to act on, and whether she had ever required more than probable before acting. She had not. She was not going to start now. The night before the full moon, Mira and Cale and Osric and Aldrich sat around the table in Myra's cottage. The journal was open. Myra's notebooks were open. The prepared compounds were on the shelf, labeled. The new chains, heavier than the first set, forged by Boris with the specific investment of a craftsman who understood exactly what he was making and for what purpose, were ready. Mira told them what she had found. She told them about Sister Anselm and the Moorish physician and the 6th account and the afterwards that was possible. She told them this not as reassurance. She was careful about the difference between information and reassurance and did not use one in place of the other, but as evidence. As data. As the best available picture of what they were working with. She told them about the 3 conditions from Osric's grandfather's journal. She told them that Cale had satisfied 2 of them consistently, that the 3rd, the record of himself, was something she was going to ask him to start tonight, before the moon rose, while he could. She told them about the compounds. She told them what she expected. She told them what she did not know and what that meant for what they were about to do. Cale listened to everything. He asked 3 questions, all of them about the practical management of the next 8 hours. None of them were about himself in a way that suggested fear. They were about the plan. He was interested in the plan. He trusted the plan to the extent that it had been made by people who had done their work, and he trusted that if the plan needed to change, the people in this room were capable of changing it. Aldrich had been quiet through most of it. Near the end, before they moved to the cellar, he asked a question that surprised no one who had been paying attention to him over the past 22 days. He asked, "What do we do about Devon?" There was a silence. Osric said, "That is the next question." Mira said, "I know. I have been thinking about it for 12 days. Aldrich said, "I think he comes to the south edge of the Greywood. I think he's been there. I think I've seen the same shadow in the same place 3 mornings in a row, and I don't think it's a deer." Another silence. Longer. Mira looked at him for a moment. Then she opened a new page in her notebook and wrote something at the top and underlined it. Then she went down to the cellar to help Cale with the chains. The second full moon rose over Ashenford on the 27th night. It rose the way the moon always rises, indifferent to the particular quality of the night it was rising over, indifferent to the chains in the cellar and the compounds on the shelf and the pages of the Moorish physician's 6th account that Mira had read 4 times and committed to a kind of operational memory she used for information she needed available without pause. The moon did not know and did not care about any of this. It rose because it had been rising for longer than the concept of caring had existed, and it would continue rising long after that concept had run its course. Cale felt it the way he always felt it. The pressure from the inside. The room that was too full. The air with weight. This time was different from the last time in one specific way: the compounds were in him. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself. But Mira had given him the preparation 4 hours before the moon peaked, and he was aware of something in the background of the pressure that had not been there before, not a reduction of it, not a wall against it, but a quality in himself that was slightly more present than usual. As if the fixed point inside him, the name, the memories, the record of who he was, had slightly more resolution than it usually did at this phase of the cycle. He noted this with the same flat precision he had described to Aldrich in the yard. He noted it and did not draw conclusions from it, because one data point was not a conclusion and he was in the middle of the experiment and this was not the time for conclusions. The time for conclusions was after. Mira was at the top of the cellar stairs with her notebook. She had been there since an hour before the moon peaked. She was documenting everything she could observe. His responses to her questions, his voice, the quality of his answers, the timing of when the answers started to slow and blur at the edges, the specific progression. She had a baseline from the previous moon. She had the new moon to compare it to. What she observed was this: the progression was slower. Not dramatically slower. Not slow enough to declare success or draw any conclusion that a scientist with her standards would stand behind in company. But measurably slower. The point at which his answers started to slow had moved. By how much she would calculate later. Enough to note. Aldrich was on the north wall. He had asked to be on the north wall. Osric had agreed to this and had also put 2 other guards there, both of whom knew the shape of the situation if not all its specifics, both of whom were reliable men who had been chosen partly for their reliability and partly for their specific quality of courage, not the absence of fear, but the ability to function in the presence of it. The Greywood was quiet for a long time. Then it was not. What came was not toward the wall. Not this time. It came along the south tree line, which was where Aldrich had seen the shadow 3 mornings in a row, and it stopped there. At the edge of the trees. Not approaching. Not retreating. Simply present, at the edge, in the moonlight. Aldrich saw it from the wall. The silhouette. The size of it, which he now recognized, which was different from the first time he had seen it when he had not had a name for it. He saw it stop at the tree line and stand there with an intentionality that was not a predator's intentionality, not the stillness of something gathering for a charge, but the stillness of something that was choosing to be visible. Choosing. He held his lantern up. Not out of instinct this time. Deliberately. The way Cale had been teaching him, the chosen response arriving before the instinctive one, or at least alongside it. He held the lantern up, and across the distance and the moonlight, the silhouette at the tree line was still. And then it turned. And went back into the dark. Of its own choosing. Aldrich stood on the wall for a long time after that. He did not lower the lantern. He was not sure, looking back on it later, whether he was holding it up as a signal or whether he was holding it up because something in him believed that the lantern being visible was useful. That the light itself was a thing worth having in the world, whether or not anyone was still looking at it. When the moon went down, he lowered it. He went to tell Mira. And that is where we leave Ashenford on the night of the second moon.